Now, while we're talking about reforms and attempts to use this post-pandemic slump to reform and liberalize movements, we have to talk about what's happening with the Agri bills. Now, fresh Agri laws were passed a few months ago, and farmers' protests have been mounting against them. A round of talks was held today between the central government and representatives of farmer unions who have been at the border of Delhi and Haryana and other neighboring states for over 4 days now. But the talks were pretty much inconclusive. Another round is expected to take place on Thursday. Let me go across first to Nilashish Chaudhary of the Times Network, who's giving us details of what really happened in that meeting and why there was no common ground that was found so far.
Well, the meeting, which went on at Vigyan Bhavan for over 3 hours, ended in a stalemate as neither the government nor the farmers could come to any middle ground with respect to the new farmer legislations. Now, the farmers continued to be rigid on their demands that all these legislations be repealed at once and specific laws regarding MSPs be put into place. The government, which is trying to say that these 3 acts are a part of their bigger plan of agricultural reforms, will have to try and show the light of day to the farmers who are not entirely convinced that these legislations could in fact work out in the longer run. The dispute arises from the fact that any such legislation that comes in which proposes to reform the current structure will face a degree of apprehension, and that is exactly what is being seen right now. Now, the government going forward will have to show the farmers that not only will this benefit them in the first 2 years, but also later on, with issues such as the mandis continuing to be there and not becoming defunct being a primary issue. The farmers who say that the government is not willing to listen to them, despite the kind of proposals that the government made through a presentation, as we learned today, have been said to be not entirely in favor of farmers. However, another meeting will take place on the 3rd of December, but the agitation, which has gone on for 6 days now, will continue.
All right, I'm joined now by Mr. T. Nanda Kumar, who's former Agricultural Secretary and former Chairman of the NDDB, that's the National Dairy Development Board. Mr. Nanda Kumar, thank you so much for speaking with us here on the India Development Debate. We've been attempting to shed light on all the complications and intricacies of this issue through the last several days of our coverage on the farmer protests, even as we talk about what both sides are saying and what they think is the right move. I want your view today, sir, on why you think these agitations are continuing. Is this a case of lack of communication? Is this a case of farmers having fears, and are those fears real or misplaced in your view?
I think there has been some lack of communication, or let me say inadequate communication. The positive sign is that government has started talking to farmers, and I think any negotiation with farmers, you don't expect a result on the first day. It'll take time, and I think we have to continue that line of discussion. And with some convincing, I'm sure that a solution can be found. Now, there are apprehensions, and these apprehensions arise primarily from the fear that MSP may be diluted, and this open-ended procurement may come to stop sometime sooner than later. And this creates a set of problems for the farmers, because typically farmers from Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, etc., who produce substantial surplus quantities of rice and wheat are the ones who are more apprehensive than the other farmers. For instance, farmers who are in vegetables or fruits, I don't think they really have an issue on this. The apprehension comes from a couple of factors. One, that the Punjab, Haryana, Western UP areas have a very well developed mandi system and logistics, which ensures that all the quantities that are brought into the mandis are cleared very quickly. And this is done by the state agencies with support from the Food Corporation of India. Now, can a private sector step up and replace them? Probably not. And that is one area where I think they are apprehensive. The second is, I think, in states like Bihar, which has abolished the APMC, the farmers are still struggling to get a minimum support price. So they fear that they might end up getting a lower price, and that is the second kind of an apprehension that they have. The third is that um, the the act, which is the Mandi Bypass Act, as is commonly called today, allows people to buy essentially, I mean, the farming produce outside the Mandi premises without paying a cess. Now that will affect the cess revenue of the mandis, which in the case of Punjab is roughly about 3% plus another 3% of rural development, which they feel might become a hindrance to development of further markets and rural infrastructure. I think these are the basic kind of apprehensions, and obviously a lot of people have been talking about, starting from the Nanda Kumar committee, which I think they quote very often, that the country cannot afford to have 80 million tons of wheat and rice in stocks, whereas the Food Security Act demand is much less. So at some point, we need to take a call on the volume of food subsidy, and we may have to reduce the volume that FCI is procuring. I think all these put together, there is genuinely an apprehension that the MSP might come down and they might have a problem selling their stuff.
Now herein lies the concern, Mr. Nanda Kumar. Like you said, that the MSP logically, if you follow on through this reform, and there is good reason for it, needs to perhaps be pared down. But farmers are, as it is, feeling very vulnerable when it comes to getting the right remuneration for all their efforts. And feel insecure without a proper market. The government has been saying that we're not going to touch MSP, and let's be honest, it would be politically very difficult for any government, however strong, to slash down MSPs. Why don't they just put it in the bill? Why don't they write it into the law?
Yeah, there are two issues here. One is, how exactly do you put MSP into the bill? The only commodity which has a statutory minimum price is sugarcane. The rest is a minimum support price, which is not statutory. It is a minimum support price provided by the government if the prices fall below the benchmark price announced by the government. The statutory minimum price in sugarcane is there because it's a contractual obligation of the sugar mill, and there is a law which kind of earmarks the area from which the mills buy sugarcane. So the statutory price mechanism works there, but it may be extremely difficult to put a statutory minimum price into the current legislation. Yes, it can be brought in. It can be brought in both the Mandi Bypass Act and the Contract Farming Act, where they talk about legal remedies. I suppose it should not be difficult for the government to say that wherever any of the parties seek legal remedies, they will be available only at an MSP or above price. That I don't know whether it will kind of find favor with the farmers, but I suppose that is one way out.
What are the other sort of options that you see, Mr. Nanda Kumar, as you know, both sides look for a middle ground? Farmers are adamant that they want the laws completely repealed. It seems very unlikely that the government will do that because it's been passed by Parliament, and these protests, as you mentioned, have been restricted to farmers from a few states. Is there a visible middle ground here in which both sides can leave the table satisfied?
At this point, it seems very difficult, but I think we need to assure the farmers that MSP will continue. There are many ways of assuring this. It is not necessary that it has to be a legal mandate, because so far the MSP has been operating without a legal mandate. It's a policy of the government, it gets implemented, and therefore people have been getting benefit from the MSP regime. So how do we now assure them that MSP will continue? I suppose some kind of a policy statement made in Parliament saying that, okay, for the next 10 years or whatever, the minimum support price and open-ended procurement will continue. The mandis will continue to be helped, and the Food Corporation of India will not buy outside the mandis, which means that you kind of ensure that the mandi system works and they get their revenue for whatever rural development they get. I suppose as we go along, there might be a way forward. But I suppose that some assurance and maybe one or two small amendments in the acts that have been passed may be required to give that assurance a formal shape.
I want to get a sense from you on how crucial it is to have the states on board. The fact is that there is a political fight behind this as well. Of course, the farmers are pushing forward with their own demands, but without the cooperation of large agrarian states like Punjab and Rajasthan on board, can any new set of reforms also be actually played out in any meaningful way?
Well, really speaking, no. Without the states on board, you cannot have reforms. But let's also be fair to the governments that they have been trying to reform the Agriculture Produce Market Committee Acts for quite some time. I think large number of committees have gone in. At least I remember 2 decades have gone into kind of trying to tell the states to reform the APMCs, to allow a certain amount of freedom to farmers to sell their goods wherever they would like to sell them. But yes, I think the support of the important state governments, and I would count most of the large producing states, be it a dairy producing state, be it a vegetable producing state, etc., on board and see what is it that they really want as a change. I don't think they have an objection to the entire law. I don't think any state government has objected to the whole thing. I think it's about 1 or 2 sections here and there which might need tweaking, or maybe a new section to be introduced in where you mentioned MSP in some context or the other, because MSP is only for about 23 commodities, and there are more than 100 commodities which are sold in the agriculture domain. So I suppose we are talking about 23 major commodities as MSP. I'm sure there is a way forward in trying to find a solution which is acceptable to at least majority of the states.
Yeah, right now the whole conversation has actually become very sensitive, with everyone giving in their points of view on it, which may be mudding the waters furthermore. Let's see if a solid and very honest conversation takes place on Thursday, which would come up with a real solution. It also brings to question why all of these concerns were not addressed in the first place before you undertake such huge reforms. With that, I want to thank you for joining us and explaining this very critical issue to us today, Mr. Nanda Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just want to add a bit of what has happened on this story. I mean, I talked about the wide variety of opinions coming in on the farmers' protests, and one of those happened to be Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And now we know that the Sikh community has a huge presence in Canada, is very active in Canadian politics as well. And Justin Trudeau was talking about the farmer protests in an event where he was interacting with people of Sikh or Sikhs of Indian origin, where he called the farmer protests concerning. He said that the situation is concerning and said his government will always be there to defend the rights of farmers. A rather sharp response followed from the Ministry of External Affairs, who said that the comments were uninformed, were unwarranted and ill-informed. They further went on to say that farmer protests are basically internal affairs of the country. So that's how big it has become. The Canadian Prime Minister has been dragged into it unwittingly as well. We'll take a very short break at this point on the show, but stay tuned. The India Revival Mission up next.